My title this morning is The Ark of Enlightenment, or How the Story of Noah's Ark Can Enlighten Us. History is built upon history. Civilizations are built upon civilizations. Layer after layer is laid down as planets and stars and galaxies whirl through the universe in an exquisite and seemingly endless waltz. One civilization digs its foundation on the grounds where another civilization has previously flourished and died. One history is influenced and altered by a history that preceded it. Why does this happen? Well, it happens because we're human beings and we remember. It is because we hear their stories. It is because we remember their stories, well, at least in part. And if we don't remember them exactly, it's okay. We alter them a bit to make them sound better. We add and subtract from their stories and make them our stories. When we became a little more sophisticated, we wrote them down. You know, the stories, the myths, the legends, the histories. At first, we drew pictures on cave walls, pictures of heroic stories about hunts and battles, kings and giants. But we weren't through. We developed symbols. You know, a symbol for each word. Later on, a symbol for each character. And if you put enough characters together, you have a word. And if you put enough words together, you have a story. Chisel them in stone, print them on clay tablets, inscribe them on parchment, and even use a big machine and print them on paper. Make a book. We've come a long way in communicating our stories and myths, but it's the same layering process that has been going on for 3 million years. One civilization becomes the next civilization's myths, with slightly different twists and turns. But it's layer upon layer that is written down, not necessarily in an exact history, but a perceptual history. It might go like this. That's the way I see it. That's the way I remember it. That's the way I heard it. Or it must be true. It's in the book. Soon enough, we believe it. That's the critical word, belief. If I hear it enough, if I read it in the book, it must be true. And if it's true, I have to believe it. But what if I don't believe it when everybody else around me does believe it? Well, this morning there's no time to discuss such heresy. But I do have a concrete example of how this works. It might go something like this. God was angry with his special creature. You see, God had created this magnificent creature above all of his other creatures. He called it man. And from man, he made woman. But the creature became unruly. These creatures were loud and boisterous and questioning. They were difficult to deal with. They weren't following the rules. They were sinful. Well, what's a sin, you may ask? Well, a sin is when you break the rules. Well, who makes the rules? Guys. It's always the guys that make the rules. Well, why do they get to make the rules? Well, it's simple. They had the money. They had the power over women. They were mostly self-appointed because even though they weren't, they thought they were better. This whole appointment business has been incestuous since the very beginning. Buddies appointing buddies, families anointing families. Anyway, God was disgusted with his creatures, the humans. But he did like this one guy, Noah. And that's because Noah was a rule follower. So Noah told him to build an ark. That's what they called a boat in those days. Build this ark. And basically God said, Noah, build an ark out of gopher wood, whatever gopher wood is, and fill it with your family and all the animals, 2 by 2. I'm going to give you a real frog strangler rain, and I am going to drown all these sinners. Noah was a rule follower. He did exactly what God told him to do. And then God did exactly what he said he would do. And that's how we came to have the story of Noah and the flood. For thousands of years, people have been telling that story, and telling it as though it were absolutely true, exactly the way it is written down in Genesis. Christians and Jews all over the world have retold that story as an absolute factual event. Problems arise, however, when people start to question. Now, remember what I said about the paintings and the tablets and the books? Well, when you begin to read other people's paintings, tablets, and books, and you find out that they believed exactly what you believe, and then you find out that their civilization is older than your civilization, you begin to wonder if your myth was exactly your myth. And then you begin to wonder, well, where do these stories start in the very beginning? Where do they come from in the first place? Well, that's really what happened about 100 years ago. Well, actually, slightly less than 100 years ago. We started questioning, and when you start questioning, you begin to unravel some of the Christian truths. Prior to 100 years ago, most people believed that all of the Christian stories were true exactly as they were written. But some smart people dug up some ancient cuneiform tablets. Not only that, they were able to figure out how to read these tablets. They learned to read and understand the languages, primitive languages, the languages of early Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word meaning between waters, or the land between waters. You can identify with that. Hippopotamus is a water horse. So it's the land between the waters, and that was the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. This area has often been called the cradle of civilization. Many scholars believe now that the finding of these tablets is really what initiated the study of comparative religion. Pioneering scientists like Benjamin Mazar, Leonard Woolley, and T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia, began to explore some of the most intriguing unsolved mysteries of the Old Testament. Later on, other scientists like James Bennett Pritchard, Gerald LaRue, and even Joseph Campbell began to put this together so that we could understand the layering of history and the telescoping of history. We know now that indeed there was a flood. There were many floods. Some of these floods were yearly floods, but there were also several extraordinary floods. But it wasn't just one flood. It was dozens or even hundreds. In 1929, Leonard Woolley and his team were digging deep into the earth. They would dig down past one civilization, down through that civilization to another civilization, down past that. And at that point, they began to see a graphic picture of how one civilization's ruins was covered by another civilization. Mud structures have a very short shelf life in the sands and annals of time. And it became obvious that if they kept going, they would keep finding different civilizations. This team of archaeologists purposely selected the area east of Karnak in Jerusalem because that area had been identified as the location of the Garden of Eden. It was also the birthplace of Abraham, Cain, Shem, Noah, and Eve. In the digging process, though, something happened. They came to a dead end. They thought this was the area of the first known civilization. The team struck a very thick layer of brown clay. That seemed to be the end of it, the very first civilization in the region. However, Leonard Woolley had a hunch. He said, "Keep digging." And they did. The team dug through roughly 10 feet of what would be later determined as silt and sediment. It appears that around 2800 BC, there was a horrendous flood. When Woolley saw this, he declared it was Noah's flood right off the bat. He even sold little vials of silt, calling it from Noah's flood. This is so that he could promote his own name and finance future expeditions. We now know there have been countless floods in that flat plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. Most of them were regular annual floods, but several of them were just these huge floods. And from all of these floods came lots of myths about how God destroyed his best and worst creation, man. So, which of the many floods was the basis for Noah's flood myth? We don't really know. The interesting thing about this is that every time you trace a legend back through history to one civilization, they report they got it from an earlier civilization. And you know, the legend usually starts out long, long ago. Well, it was long, long ago because it was a previous civilization. So the answer to my question is simply this. Our ancestors had ancestors, and their ancestors had ancestors, and so on. All of our ancestors' stories and myths seem to have come from an earlier time. We can never really trace this back, and trust me, I have tried to trace these legends back as far as you can, and every time I get back to what I think was the civilization of origin, they report they got it from an earlier civilization. The first recorded, and I emphasize recorded flood story that we have to date, comes from ancient Samaria. Now keep in mind, 100 years ago, we didn't even know that the Sumerian civilization had existed. Samaria started about 5000 BC. It had its own language and alphabet, its own culture, unique, that we had no idea that it was even it had even existed. So shortly after the turn of the century, these archaeologists unearthed its secrets. They were on clay tablets. Perhaps the most interesting find was a tablet telling the story of heroic Gilgamesh, who ruled the city of Uruk. Now, I won't go through the entire epic, but I would like to show you how myth is built upon myth. In his quest for immortality, Gilgamesh sought out Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim was immortal, and he had survived the great flood of his day. Now, I won't, as I said, I won't go through the whole thing, but I want to give you a couple of examples from the story of Utnapishtim and his flood in the Bible. From Gilgamesh, line 24. And keep in mind, this is about 1,300 to 1,500 years before Noah's flood story. From Gilgamesh, line 24. Tear down this house and build a ship. From Genesis 6:14. Make an ark of gopher wood. From line 27 of Gilgamesh. Aboard the ship thou take the seed of all living things, from the Bible, Genesis 6:19. Of every living thing, all flesh, 2 of every sort. Line 109 from Gilgamesh, gathering speed as it blew, submerging the mountains, from Genesis 6:20. 15 cubits upward the water did prevail, and the mountains were covered. From line 147, the dove went forth but came back. Genesis 8:7, he sent forth a dove, but the dove found no rest. Line for line, verse for verse, there is an uncanny resemblance between the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah's flood. We find the same similarities if you look at the Christian 10 Commandments and the law code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi. The same thing when we compare the story of Moses in the bulrushes. The story of Great Sargon had the same story. They were both placed in a reed basket, and they both floated down the Nile to avoid being killed by a bad king. Flood stories have existed since the beginning of the human epoch. I have found flood stories in the cultures throughout the Middle East, Greece, India, China, Australia, Southern Asia, the islands of the Pacific, Europe, and even some early North American cultures. There is a high likelihood that flood stories were in our culture long before the Sumerian flood stories, but to date we just don't have those written records. We do know that at this point, the first recorded flood story is from Samaria, followed by the Babylonian flood story, followed by the Assyrian flood story, followed by the Hebrew story of Noah. If you look at the myths, there's likely a grain of truth in every single mythological story. But when it gets told over and over and over thousands of times, each time it gets a little tweaking to fit the needs of the culture of the storyteller. Our most likely conclusion is that all of our myths come from fairly common events in the lives of human beings. Our mythical heroes were probably very famous people of their times, but in the retelling of their adventures, it led them to be presented in myth as supernatural beings. So, what's the benefit to telling and retelling of stories like the flood story? Well, it shows us that our histories are based on layer upon layer upon layer of civilization building on civilization. They were teaching stories designed to teach us how to live. So what's the benefit to us of discovering these ancient tablets? The first benefit is that there is an actual raising of consciousness. We become more aware of who we are and where we come from. Prior to the discovery of the Christian flood story, we didn't realize it was a borrowed flood story from many ancient cultures. Believers were convinced that it was true and factual and exclusively a Christian story. Now scholarly people realize that these myths go way back before recorded history. So, if you will, Noah's Ark for us becomes like an Ark of Enlightenment. We become enlightened and aware of ourselves and our history. It's a story of conscious raising, a realization that these stories are older than history. And when we do, it helps to remove a veil of supernatural superstition. It's also probable that the flood myth represents a collection of many, many floods in areas that flooded often. Perhaps more importantly, there has to be a realization that we are intractably connected to our ancient ancestors, and we are connected by the stories they told us and the stories we will pass on. Even in the irrational, unscientific beliefs we cling to, we're still connected. When we can't see the metaphorical and instead we hold fast to that concrete, absolute idea in the story, I think we forego the real messages. Our most ancient ancestors, whether they realize it or not, are really sending us messages through time. However, so often we get like the monkey trying to get the peanut out of the jar, holding our fist tight, and we can't get it out. And what we have to do is we have to turn loose of the concreteness of these stories and instead see the message in the metaphor, and then apply the messages that we've learned to our reality. So, what's the metaphorical message in the flood story? I would suggest the answer to that question is simple. I think it points to renewal. Call it what you may. You can call it renewal or restoration or recreation, redemption, salvation, new birth, or that most famous Christian word, resurrection. Think of the other stories in the Bible. The story of Lazarus rising from the dead, Jesus' resurrection, the destruction of Sodom, the turnaround life of Mary Magdalene, Moses in the reed basket, or the flood story. I think they all suggest transition. That good things can come from bad events, that things are not hopeless, that we are not helpless, that positive can triumph over negative. The flood itself symbolizes the drowning of evil. Just as baptism, which is nothing more than ritualized drowning, symbolizes the drowning of evil or bad in ourselves. These stories symbolize a rebirth to a new and better life. They all tell us that we can change, that we can rise above our ignorance, that we can overcome disasters that befall us. These stories reflect a termination of one part of our life and the beginning of a new part of our life. If we look beyond the messages from religious pulpits throughout the world and examine the ancient metaphors, I think we gain much more. For example, the story of the Good Samaritan is a powerful message for anyone, in any culture, in any age. The turning water to wine is a story of transition. The story of the fishes and the loaves addresses cooperation and concern. The Tower of Babel is a wonderful allegory. There are messages in Noah's flood story. But I think that it is important when we read one of these stories and we're looking for the message, I think it is so important to say, how does this message relate to me? And how can I use it to benefit my life? Because they were all teaching stories, trying to tell us how to be better, more humane human beings. So I think we have to ask constantly, what is this story, this myth, this legend trying to teach me in my own personal life? We should be constantly asking, what is the universe trying to tell me? So anyway, I've put together some ideas about what Noah's flood story might mean to some of us. And these are just like thought starters. All right, number one, get on board with friends. The buddy system is always safer, and it's a whole lot more fun. Number two, plan ahead no matter what you're expecting. Get on the stick. You don't start building the ark the day the rain starts. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. One that I like is a good rain can wash away a lot of trouble. From every disaster in our life, we can gain wisdom about ourselves. How about life is in a permanent state of transition? It's never going to be static. It's always moving. Everyone's journey should always be toward our own personal, authentic reality. Or maybe we learn through suffering. We learn much more about ourselves and the world when things don't go well than we do when everything just slides perfectly. Suffering is always temporary, so hold on. We all face tests and trials. It's how we manage them that really counts. If this were your ark, how would you sail it? And last, no matter what you call it, your own private, personal renewal or restoration or recreation or renaissance or new birth or resurrection is always only a breath away. So be it.